the Trump administration is ramping up its battle with legacy media.
FCC Chair Brandon Carr wrote on X, Comcast outlets spent days misleading the American public, implying that Abrego Garcia was merely a law-abiding U.S. citizen, just a regular Maryland man. When the truth comes out, they ignore it. Comcast knows that federal law requires its licensed operations to serve the public interest. News distortion doesn't cut it.
Carr continued, writing, Abrego Garcia came to America illegally from El Salvador, was validated as a member of the violent MS-13 gang, a transnational criminal organization, and was denied bond by an immigration court for failure to show he would not pose a danger to others. Why does Comcast ignore these facts of obvious public interest?
Comcast is the parent company of NBC and MSNBC. Trump also blasted Comcast recently, calling them a disgrace to the integrity of broadcasting.
Democrat State Congressman Ben Waxman wrote on X, the chair of the FCC is openly threatening to punish Comcast, a major employer headquartered in my district, because MSNBC aired views he doesn't like. That's not regulation, that's government retaliation against protected speech. It's dangerous, authoritarian, and wrong. I suspect we're going to have a disagreement on this one, Amber. I think that Brandon Carr is entitled to whatever views he wishes as a private citizen about the media. I think media criticism is fine. This is the head of the FCC, though, echoing Trump talking points when he has the power and enormous influence over media licenses. And so I see it as very much an intimidatory thing to try to secure or to leverage his influence to secure favorable coverage for the Trump White House.
I don't think we'll disagree quite as much as you think. So I want to read the relevant portion of FCC law in regards to what they've said about news distortion, which is the alleged grievance that he has against Comcast. And it says, the commission often receives complaints concerning broadcast journalism, such as allegations that stations have aired inaccurate or one-sided news reports, covered stories inadequately, or overly dramatized the events that they covered. The commission generally will not intervene in these cases because it would be inconsistent with the First Amendment. And then they go on to say, however, as public trustees, broadcast licensees may not intentionally distort the news. The FCC has stated that rigging or slanting the news is a most heinous act against the public interest. And here's where the enforcement mechanism comes in. The commission will investigate a station if it receives documented evidence of rigging or slanting, such as testimony or other documentation from individuals with direct personal knowledge that a licensee or its management engaged in an intentional falsification of the news. Of particular concern would be evidence of the direction to employees from station management to falsify the news. So the only case that Carr would have here is if he had employees of these Comcast-owned networks, particularly NBC, which is a broadcast station, that they were directed from management to intentionally leave out the allegation of Abrego Garcia being MS-13, or if they had some kind of emails attesting to that fact. Outside of that, them simply leaving that information out without the compelling evidence that they intentionally did so to slant the news a certain way would not be grounds for the FCC to intervene.
Right, and I think that is obviously a very important thing to point out, and that absent that evidence, there isn't really a path forward. One of the reasons why there is such consternation, I think, about what Brandon Carr did is that the tweet that sort of set all this off was actually a quote tweet of Stephen Chung, who is the White House Communications Director, who has a screen grab where he calls it shameful that CNN and MSNBC didn't offer live coverage of Rachel Moran's mother speaking from the White House lectern. Now, you can, of course, argue one way or another whether that should have been given live coverage, but the idea that that somehow rises to the level of there needing to be official regulatory action against those networks, I mean, that seems pretty absurd. Now, in the case of those MSNBC and CNN or cable networks, so that's sort of outside the FCC's purview anyway in terms of licenses. But the fact of going after the parent company complaining about Comcast networks and so on, I do think that raises the spectre of intimidation, even though, as you say, from what you read, it seems highly unlikely it would go forward.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It seems like a little bit of an overreach here unless he has that direct evidence that they were intentionally doing these things to paint a certain picture. Now, you could argue maybe there's liberal bias at the networks, and that causes them to cover or not cover certain stories because of just whatever internal feelings they have about political issues. Maybe they haven't reviewed the court documents themselves regarding Abrego Garcia's alleged ties to MS-13, and that's why they didn't include them. But it seems to me there has to be a more direct line between a management directive and what the employees end up doing.
Yeah, and I think there particularly has to be that kind of direct line, because some of the other language you read out earlier in those regulations seems to me sadly anachronistic in a way, in the sense that it implies that there is otherwise a sort of commonly agreed fairness as to what constitutes fair or unfair media coverage. And regrettably, in my view, that has just fallen away entirely to give way to people who just, on left and right, want the news to specifically reflect whatever their beliefs are. And so it would be really difficult, I think, to come to a consensus right now in American society about what constitutes fair news coverage. That in itself makes it more important that there is additional evidence required.
Yeah, because I do think that they would have a very strong argument that the coverage has been generally unfair in regards to the Abrego Garcia case. And I have been very disturbed by this because when his case was first brought to the public attention, it seemed like no one had actually read the court filing from his lawyer in regards to the allegations of MS-13, and now we've gotten the court documents about his wife filing for a domestic violence protection order. And then I reported exclusively yesterday on a Homeland's investigation document that indicates he was stopped on suspicion of human trafficking back in 2022. None of those things really have been reported by the corporate media. It's really been reliant on independent and conservative media to sort of get those things out there and provide a little bit of balance to this case. And actually, initially, his lawyer did not include the documents from immigration court, including the appeals process and even his application for asylum in his filing against the Trump administration. It was actually the Trump administration that read those documents into the court record a few days after, when they were arguing against the TRO. But go on Court Listener, click through the links. I mean, it just seemed like a dereliction of journalistic duty to me.
Well, I agree about, I always try to delve into as many court documents as I can get my hands on, not only because they give you background, but because by the nature of them being court documents, people are generally reluctant to just lie blatantly. People can make different arguments, but that is different from presenting factually false information. In general, I would say I do take your point about there being sometimes a lack of proper background given in this particular case. Now, I was obviously opining about it earlier on in today's show, and what I was trying to do was acknowledge all of those realities that do exist and still make an argument that I consider persuasive, obviously, that the Trump administration has acted illegally in deporting this man to El Salvador. That is, it seems to me, different from pretending that there was not two immigration judges who believed that he was a member of MS-13. That's not my argument. My argument's about the specific action taken to deport him to El Salvador. So I do think those things, as much information as possible, should be given in relation to, I did read your story about him being questioned under suspicion of human trafficking, and no charges were ever filed. I mean, that's the other part of that, right? He was let on his way.
The FBI, according to the Tennessee Stars report, which was prior to mine, which had the actual Homeland Investigations document, the FBI, during the Joe Biden administration, apparently said that they weren't going to pursue an investigation on those charges.
So, I think that it is worthwhile knowing that that happened. I think that you can have all sorts of arguments about what one can extrapolate from that incident or not. I don't think you can extrapolate very much from it, but it's worth knowing that it happened.
Oh, gosh, I disagree. I think you can extrapolate a lot. I mean, he had 8 people in the van going from Texas to Maryland. The van was owned by his boss, who works in construction. They all provided his home address as their address. They had no luggage. They all were asked to write their names down, but sort of intentionally made them all illegible so that the officer couldn't track them down. to me, it reeks of human trafficking. But obviously, they didn't investigate it through the FBI. So.
I mean, my argument with that is that you can't get into the situation of imputing guilt on the basis that someone was stopped and then let go. If there is compelling evidence against people, that evidence can be tried in court. We can't just get into the thing of, well, the cop stopped him and a cop said this was suspicious and that was suspicious, therefore we've decided he did it. You know, I don't think it proves anything one way or another.
I guess, I mean, in the court of public opinion, I would say that it seems pretty obvious to me. But, I mean, all of that being said, on the point that you were making about the difference between the legal issues of the Abrego Garcia case and then the political issues, you know, I think that actually Democrats and immigration activists and people who have been lobbying on behalf of Abrego Garcia would have avoided all of this if they actually had, from the jump, acknowledged the realities of this guy's situation, of the alleged MS-13 ties, of the domestic violence issues, of the alleged human trafficking. If they had said, look, we recognize that this guy's not like a poster child for the perfect immigrant. He's not the perfect father or the perfect husband, but he had a withholding of removal order, and the Trump administration can't circumvent that. There wouldn't be this issue of Chris Van Hollen, frankly, looking like a clown, going down to El Salvador to sit and have a margarita with this guy who is an alleged gangbanger and wife beater. And they really opened themselves up to that political damage by not doing their due diligence on the case and running headlines calling him a Maryland man. You know, Chris Van Hollen saying that he's an American citizen when he wasn't, calling him his constituent, but then refusing to meet with Rachel Morin's family. I mean, all of those things could have been avoided, and it just seems like they were so eager to jump on a case of the mass deportations going wrong that they're the ones who provided all of this political cover for Republicans in the Trump administration.
See, I was actually agreeing with quite a lot until you called Van Hollen a clown there, Amber, and I was like, I don't think that's actually fair. I think Van Hollen is seen very much through the prism of where people stand on the underlying case. But the point is that you are right, I think, to say that the case being made would have been stronger had information that was available in court filings been acknowledged in the process of making that case. That is, I think, something that is worth doing because it actually strengthens the case in arguing that the deportation of the man was illegal, and whether he is a perfect person or not is irrelevant to that particular point, which is, of course, the argument I was making earlier on. So you see, Rising, living
Full
up to
circle.
a higher standard. Full circle.
Up next on Rising, are Democrats caught in Trump's terror trap? Our next guest thinks so. Stick around to find out.